Is US planning to wage war against Iran through Saudi-led military coalition? Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe traveled to Tehran on Wednesday to warn that an accidental conflict could be sparked amid heightened tensions between Iran and the US, a message that came hours after Yemen's Iranian-backed Houthi rebels attacked a Saudi airport, wounding 26 people. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe landed Wednesday in Tehran on a mission to ease tensions between the US and Iran, just hours after Iranian-backed rebels in Yemen launched an attack on an airport in Saudi Arabia, wounding 26 people. Abe's trip is the highest-level effort yet to de-escalate the crisis as Tehran appears poised to break the 2015 nuclear deal it struck with world powers, an accord that the Trump administration pulled out of last year. It's also the first visit of a sitting Japanese premier in the 40 years since the Islamic Revolution. But success may prove difficult for Abe, as the Houthi rebel attack on Saudi's Abha regional airport underscored. Separately, the front page of the Iranian daily Fariq Dagan, or Educated, published Wednesday morning a picture of a mushroom cloud from a nuclear blast, a reference to America's bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. "How can you trust a war criminal, Mr. Abe?" the newspaper asked in dual English and Farsi headlines. Hardline news outlets in Iran immediately picked up the front page from the paper, published by students of Islamic Azad University, which has campuses across the nation. Abe's plane landed at Tehran's Mehrabad International Airport on Wednesday afternoon, where he was greeted by Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif. He was to immediately meet Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and with Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on Thursday. Abe landed just hours after the attack in Abha. The Yemeni rebels, known as Houthis, said they launched a cruise missile at the Saudi airport, while the kingdom said 26 people were hurt. Though there were no fatalities, it was the largest number of civilians to be injured in Saudi Arabia as a result of an attack by the rebels since the start of the Saudi-led war in Yemen more than 4 years ago. The rebels' Al Masirah satellite news channel said the missile hit its intended target, halting air traffic at the airport in the town of Abha in the kingdom's southwest, some 165 kilometers, 100 miles, from the Saudi-Yemen border. The war in Yemen, the Arab world's poorest country, has killed tens of thousands of civilians, with most of the deaths blamed on Saudi-led coalition airstrikes, and has pushed Yemen to the brink of famine. Saudi coalition spokesman Turki al-Maliki was quoted on the state-run Al-Kabirya news channel as saying 3 women and 2 children were among those hurt and that 8 people were hospitalized while 18 suffered minor injuries. At least 1 Yemeni and 1 Indian national were among those injured in the attack, which al-Turki said struck the airport's arrivals hall between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. The Houthis have previously used ballistic missiles to target the Saudi capital, Riyadh, and the airport there. More recently, they have launched bomb-laden drones targeting a key oil pipeline and the southwest city of Khamis Mushat. A Houthi spokesman, Mohammed Abdel Salam, said Wednesday's attack was in response to Saudi Arabia's continued aggression and blockade on Yemen. Earlier in the week, he'd said Houthi attacks on Saudi airports were the best way to break the blockade of the airport in Yemen's capital, Sana'a, which the Houthis overran in 2014. Iran is threatening to resume enriching uranium closer to weapons-grade level on July 7 if European allies fail to offer new terms for the nuclear deal. While President Donald Trump says he wants to talk to Tehran, the US has piled on sanctions that have seen Iran's currency, the rial, plummet along with Iran's crucial oil exports. The US also has sent an aircraft carrier and B-52 bombers to the region, along with hundreds more troops to back up the tens of thousands already deployed across the Middle East. The US blames Iran for a mysterious attack on oil tankers off the coast of the United Arab Emirates, while Iranian-backed rebels in Yemen continue to launch coordinated drone attacks on Saudi Arabia. Japan had once purchased Iranian oil, but it has now stopped doing so over American sanctions. However, Mideast oil remains crucial to Japan, and recent threats from Iran to close off the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow mouth through which a third of all oil traded by sea passes, has raised concerns. Before boarding his airplane at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, Abe acknowledged the challenges ahead. There are concerns over rising tension in the Middle East region, he said. Japan wants to do as much as possible towards peace and stability in the region. Iran's nuclear deal, agreed to at the time by China, Russia, France, Germany, the United Kingdom and the US, saw Tehran agree to limit its enrichment of uranium exchange for the lifting of crippling sanctions. Western powers feared Iran's atomic program could allow it to build nuclear weapons, although Iran long has insisted its program was for peaceful purposes. In withdrawing from the deal last year, Trump pointed to the accord not limiting Iran's ballistic missile program and not addressing what American officials describe as Tehran's malign influence across the wider Mideast. Those who struck the deal at the time described it as a building block toward further negotiations with Iran, whose Islamic government has had a tense relationship with America since the 1979 takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and subsequent hostage crisis. Already, Iran says it quadrupled its production of low-enriched uranium. Meanwhile, U.S. sanctions have cut off opportunities for Iran to trade its excess uranium and heavy water abroad, putting Tehran on course to violate terms of the nuclear deal regardless. A year after President Donald Trump pulled out of the 2015 nuclear accord between Iran and 6 world powers, he has dramatically upped the stakes in his aggressive campaign of economic warfare against the Islamic Republic. Since last year's withdrawal, Trump's reimposition of sanctions already has reduced Iran's 2 million barrels per day oil sales by half, sending the country's economy into a tailspin. Now, exercising a policy he calls maximum pressure, Trump has targeted Iran's remaining exports by ending the sanctions waivers he previously had granted to 8 of Tehran's biggest customers. Trump's goal, to drive Iran into penury and force Tehran's leaders to accept a new nuclear deal, this time on terms that Trump and his lieutenants insist would be far more favorable to the United States and its regional allies. "We are going to zero," Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared recently, referring to Iran's oil exports. How long we remain there, at zero, depends solely on the Islamic Republic of Iran's senior leaders. We've made our demands very clear to the Ayatollah and his cronies. Both Trump and Iranian leaders insist they don't want to go to war. But ever since Trump tightened sanctions last month, the Middle East has seen a major spike in tensions, ominous signs of Iranian military moves against American forces in the region, a rapid buildup of U.S. military might just off the Iranian coast, attacks by suspected Iranian saboteurs on Arab oil tankers, and a drone attack on a Saudi pipeline by Yemen's Iranian-aligned Houthi tribesmen. Then, just as suddenly, both Washington and Tehran took a grudging step back from the brink of hostilities earlier this month as Pompeo declared the United States was prepared to talk to Iran without preconditions. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani responded by saying talks were possible, as long as Washington treated Tehran with respect. In the last 3 weeks, you've seen a serious escalation in which both the Iranians and the Americans have signaled that each has a way to deter the other, Aaron David Miller, a former Middle East advisor to 6 secretaries of state, told Newsweek. But even though U.S. and Iranian forces are now trying to stay out of each other's way, he cautions, the danger of an armed clash still exists. Indeed, there is no sign the administration is ready to withdraw the aircraft carrier strike group, the squadron of B-52 bombers, the detachment of 1,500 Marines and an extra Patriot air defense system that it sent to the region. And the U.S. policy of maximum economic pressure is still in force, leaving future developments highly unpredictable. In a recent Washington Post essay, Colin Kahl, a former Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for the Middle East in the Obama administration, painted a grim scenario in which he outlined how easily the United States and Iran could blunder into war. If Iran's oil sales, the lifeblood of the country's economy, fall to a few 100,000 barrels a day because of the U.S. sanctions, Kahl said it's entirely possible the Iranian military could order Iranian-backed Shiite militias in Iraq to turn their guns on the 5,000 U.S. troops stationed there, as well as American diplomats in Baghdad's Green Zone. Further acts of sabotage targeting shipping in the Persian Gulf and stepped-up Houthi attacks on Saudi oil installations would also be likely, he said. According to Kahl, the attacks on American personnel could provoke a U.S. military response against the Iraqi militias and, in turn, the retaliatory Iranian mining of the Persian Gulf. As the violence escalates, he said, U.S. warplanes could bomb military targets inside Iran, including its nuclear facilities. In response, Iran could order its Hezbollah proxies in Lebanon and Syria to open fronts against Israel, bombarding its cities with rockets that leave hundreds dead. Israel almost certainly would retaliate with massive force, destroying Hezbollah and Iranian targets in Lebanon and Syria. As oil prices surged and Iran and its proxies drew more Israeli and American blood, the Trump administration would come under intense political pressure to come to Israel's aid and finish off the Iranian regime once and for all. The next inevitable step, Kahl said, would be a U.S. ground invasion of Iran, and a full-scale war that neither Trump nor Iranian leaders wanted. That's the nightmare scenario. For now, however, the administration is deeply divided over its Iran policy, with Trump playing the moderate and both National Security Advisor John Bolton and Pompeo taking a far more hardline stance. The president, convinced of his prowess as a deal-maker, appears confident he can force Tehran to the negotiating table, where he says he will confine his efforts to winning a better nuclear agreement than the one his predecessor reached in return for sanctions relief. Bolton and Pompeo want any new Iran agreement to go far beyond the nuclear issue to include conditions that effectively would neuter Iran as a regional power. Last May, Pompeo set out a dozen demands, including a halt in perpetuity to all Iranian nuclear enrichment, even peaceful, low-grade enrichment for medical isotopes. This would negate the most important face-saving concession that Iran won in its negotiations for the 2015 nuclear accord. But the demands also require Iran to end its ballistic missile program and halt its support for Syria, Lebanon's Hezbollah Shiite militia, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, and Yemen's Houthi rebels. Iran has rejected the U.S. demands as tantamount to total capitulation. For his part, Bolton also has made no secret of his desire to topple the regime in Tehran. America's declared policy should be ending Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution before its 40th anniversary, Bolton wrote in a Wall Street Journal op-ed in January 2018, just 2 months before Trump named him as his new national security advisor. Recognizing a new Iranian regime in 2019 would reverse the shame of once seeing our diplomats held hostage for 444 days. The former hostages can cut the ribbon to open the new U.S. embassy in Tehran. Last fall, Bolton, long a cheerleader for the use of military force, asked the Pentagon to provide options for a military strike against Iran after Iranian-backed militants fired 3 rockets that exploded harmlessly in an empty lot on the grounds of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Alarmed, then Defense Secretary James Mattis blocked the request. During the latest escalation of tensions, Bolton ordered the Pentagon to provide a revised military plan to send as many as 120,000 troops to the Middle East in the event of an Iranian attack on U.S. forces or a resumption of its nuclear program. The size of the force approached the number of troops that invaded Iraq in 2003. In an indication of the sharp divisions within the administration over Iran policy, Trump, an opponent of America's open-ended troop presence in the Middle East, later approved of sending only 1,500 additional troops to the region. Recently, there's been some speculation that Trump might fire Bolton for being too hawkish. White House officials acknowledge that the two men do not have a close relationship. But for now, they add, the president appears to be content to use Bolton in the role of bad cop, if only to keep Iran guessing about U.S. intentions. The nice thing I like about our policy is that I'm quite sure that the Iranians have no idea what President Trump might do, retired General James Jones, a former Obama national security advisor, told The Hill recently. They're off balance, and they might wake up one morning and find they no longer have a navy, for example. The example Jones chose was not random. In April 1988, in the largest naval engagement since World War II, the U.S. Navy attacked Iranian naval forces in retaliation for Iran's mining of the Persian Gulf during the Iraq-Iran War, a move that heavily damaged an American warship. By the end of the battle, U.S. forces had sunk or crippled half of Iran's operational fleet. Regional experts say the Iranian military learned valuable tactical lessons from that engagement, lessons that American officials and independent analysts believe they're now using in the current confrontation with the U.S. forces. The lessons the Iranians learned was you don't go at the U.S. military conventionally, you go at U.S. interests asymmetrically, says Miller, now vice president of the Wilson Center, a foreign policy think tank in Washington. So using many subs manned by Iranian special forces, they plant mines on Saudi and Emirati tankers. Meanwhile, the Houthis send a drone to attack a portion of Saudi's east-west pipeline. Miller says both of these attacks were significant and an ominous preview of what's likely in store as long as the Trump administration maintains its economic stranglehold on Iran. They struck these tankers 5 to 12 miles off the coast of Fujairah, one of the United Arab Emirates, he says. The pipeline was taking Saudi oil to terminals on the Red Sea. The attacks were unconventional, no one was killed, and very hard to prove authorship. There's certainly no cause at this point for the United States to attack the Iranians directly. Other regional experts agree that Iran was most likely behind the tanker and pipeline attacks, adding they were probably aimed at raising the price of oil as Tehran feels the bite of reduced exports. So far, that hasn't happened, said Henry Rome, a Middle East analyst at the Eurasia Group, an international business consultancy. But it's not for want of trying. In addition, analysts anticipate the Iranians will gradually revive prohibited elements of its nuclear program in a bid to extract some economic relief from the Europeans in return for discontinuing such activities, or to build up leverage if negotiations with the United States begin. From the Iranian point of view, the status quo is not sustainable, Rome told Newsweek. Their economy cannot survive on zero oil exports. So they're finding themselves forced to act out in a variety of ways to relieve the pressure. Iran has denied its forces carried out the attacks. Since 2011, first in Syria and then in Yemen, proxy forces of Iran and Saudi Arabia have been in constant, brutal competition. Both sides seem to have concluded that a direct war isn't in their interest, with neither having ever directly attacked the other. But there has always been a risk of escalation, and that risk will heighten dramatically on Tuesday if President Donald Trump withdraws from the Iran nuclear deal, as seems likely. That could lead to an increase in military provocations by Iran in the region, and embolden any Saudi response. It's far easier to assess the likelihood of direct conflict between Tehran and Riyadh, however, than to predict a winner. The outcome of the first Saudi-Iranian war would ultimately depend on the shape it ended up taking. The two countries differ markedly in the size and capabilities of their forces. Iran has the larger military, with two forces: the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, and the Artesh regular military composed of complementary air, naval, and land branches. The Artesh has an estimated 350,000 active-duty soldiers and controls most of Iran's more sophisticated conventional capabilities, especially in the air and maritime domains. By comparison, the IRGC, with an estimated force of 125,000, has maintained a focus on asymmetric warfare but also oversees Iran's growing unmanned aerial vehicle fleet and strategic ballistic missile programs. Additionally, through its Special Forces Division, known as the Quds Force, the IRGC commands Iran's foreign military operations and relations with client allies, such as in Syria and Iraq. Since the 1980s, intermittent sanctions and political pressure from the United States have severely degraded Iran's ability to procure military technology and weapons from other countries, which has made some of its military capabilities relatively outmoded and weak. Iran's defense spending, around $12.3 billion in 2016, is modest compared with Saudi Arabia's as one of the top defense budgets in the world, $63.7 billion in 2016 and $69.4 billion in 2017, and its defense technology generally falls well below that of other regional states. Iran's air forces fly dated platforms, such as F-5 and F-14 Tomcat variants, which have been updated domestically from aircraft inherited from the pre-revolution Pahlavi state, but struggle with intermittent inoperability. Similarly, Iran's mechanized armor is mostly a hodgepodge of pre-1979 US stock, such as the M60A1, and older Soviet tanks, such as the T-72S, procured from Russia during the 1990s. Unable to update its military capabilities, Iran has instead invested in other areas, especially ballistic missiles, to provide a competitive edge with its neighbors. Its ground-to-ground ballistic missile variants, such as the Zulfiqar, 435-mile range, and Shahab-3, 994-mile range, could potentially target strategic infrastructure and population centers well within Saudi territory. Those ranges and the large stockpile Iran has amassed have made ballistic missiles Iran's core strategic deterrent. Iran showcased that capability in June 2017 when it fired 6 Zulfiqar missiles at Islamic State-held territory near the Syrian city of Deir Ezzor, some 435 miles from the launch points in western Iran. Beyond that hard deterrent, the IRGC's investments have concentrated on developing less expensive platforms that can challenge adversaries through asymmetrical tactics. Foremost in this regard is the IRGC Navy's large fleet of fast attack crafts, which includes various types of small speedboats that can be armed with 107mm rockets, heavy machine guns, and anti-ship cruise missiles, or loaded with explosives and used in kamikaze-style strikes. These boats, along with its large stockpile of naval mines, are the IRGC's primary offensive tool against maritime adversaries in the maritime domain. The Saudi military is smaller but better armed. Saudi Arabia's primary military land, air, naval, and missile forces fall under the command of its Ministry of Defense. Combined with auxiliary forces in the Saudi Arabian National Guard, Royal Guard, and the Ministry of Interior's Border Defense Force, the Saudi military is estimated to have around 250,000 active duty personnel. Its chief strengths lie in air power and air defense. The Royal Saudi Air Force possesses several squadrons of F-15C/D Eagle and F-15 Strike Eagle fighters, along with 3 squadrons of Tornado multi-role aircraft, and 72 Eurofighter Typhoon attack aircraft. The Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces have similarly impressive capabilities, focused mainly on U.S. supplied Patriot missile batteries concentrated around critical infrastructure, military bases, and population centers. Saudi Arabia also has a small but perhaps growing stockpile of ballistic missiles. Its strategic missile force is believed to possess dozens of aging liquid-fueled Chinese DF-3 medium-range missiles, 2,485 to 3,100-mile range, and possibly some solid-fueled DF-21 medium-range missiles, 1,050-mile range, as well. Of course, capabilities are one thing, effectiveness on the battlefield another. Experience matters and can help a military identify its weaknesses and develop strengths. Both countries have had recent experience in combat, albeit in different ways and to different extents. Much of Iran's military know-how was developed during the nearly 8-year Iran-Iraq War, where it fought against a technologically superior adversary with far greater international backing. If the Iran-Iraq War taught Iran's armed forces how to survive and make limited gains through asymmetrical tactics, the post-2011 experience of the IRGC and its client allies, such as Lebanese Hezbollah and various Iraqi militias, in the Syrian, Iraqi, and Yemeni conflicts has helped it develop further in terms of command and control, integrated operations, and ground offenses. Although Iran and its clients have been inseparable from the ground successes in both Syria and Iraq, those advances have been paved by foreign air power, by the United States in Iraq and Russia in Syria. Without the support of such air power, it is doubtful that Iranian-led forces would have made any serious gains against Syria's rebels or the Islamic State. Further, they have relied on artillery bombardments, which essentially flattened the adversarial-held population centers before they were retaken. The Saudis have comparatively less combat experience. In 1991, Saudi and Kuwaiti forces struggled to defeat an Iraqi tank column that had occupied the Saudi town of Kafyi. They ultimately prevailed with U.S. support, but the battle exposed the inexperience of the Saudi military. In a precursor to the current conflict in Yemen, Saudi forces intervened across the southern border in 2009 in support of the Yemeni government's war against the Houthis. The Saudi campaign, which included Jordanian and perhaps Moroccan troops, lasted only a few months and concentrated on the bombing of Houthi positions near the border. Despite retaking some strategic high ground along the border, the aerial campaign had only a small impact on the overall ground war. That limited track record clearly did not prepare the Saudis for the current war in Yemen. But the longer the current war continues, the more experience the Saudi military will gain. Thus, as crude as it might be to think of the ongoing Yemeni conflict as military practice for the Saudis, given the brutal toll it has had on civilians, that is precisely what it has been. Without dismissing Saudi's legitimate national security concerns about Yemen, or minimizing the extensive suffering the war has caused, the conflict has offered an opportunity for the Saudis, and the Emiratis, to test their air and land capabilities in combat and to work on integrated joint operations. Still, the campaign has only had limited success. Although the Saudi-led coalition was effective early on in pushing pro-Houthi forces out of positions in the south, it has struggled to make advancements in the north. This is especially true regarding the capital, Sana'a, where Saudi Arabia's extensive bombing campaign hasn't led to corresponding gains on the ground. There have also been serious questions posed about Saudi Arabia's targeting ability and its capabilities in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, particularly in the face of the severe civilian toll the bombing campaign in Sana'a has had. Given their respective capabilities and recent experiences in combat, both countries have strengths and weaknesses, but neither has a clear advantage over the other. Saudi air power would enable it to maintain dominance in the skies in any conflict with Iran. It could likely strike Iran's critical infrastructure and military bases along the coast with air-to-ground missiles, if not penetrate Iranian territory more deeply. Iran, for its part, would likely be able to achieve primacy in the maritime domain, especially in the Persian Gulf, where its fast attack craft, diesel submarines, and mine-laying vessels could be used to target Saudi shipping, naval ships, and ports. Iran could also strike Saudi strategic infrastructure and population centers with ballistic missiles. Although Saudi Arabia's Patriot missile defense systems would likely reduce the effectiveness of such strikes, it is unlikely that those defenses could prevent all strikes from landing, especially were Iran to fire missiles in salvos. If a Saudi-Iran conflict were to occur in a vacuum, the war would not be about territory or regime change by force. Neither side can take the fight across the Persian Gulf, much less seize and hold strategic areas in adversarial territory. The conflict would be about inflicting damage to both punish the other side and compel it to cease hostile behavior. While the Saudis with their superior air power, access to foreign military technology, and far greater wealth might be better situated to endure such a conflict, if not impose greater costs on the Iranians, the Islamic Republic has less to lose and has shown an ability to withstand years of warfare against greater powers. However, it is unlikely that such a conflict would involve only those two parties and not grow to involve other states. Iran lacks state allies, except for Syria, of course, which is hardly a state now, but it does have a robust, transnational alliance with non-state clients in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Groups such as Lebanese Hezbollah or Asib al-Haq in Iraq would almost certainly support Iran in such a conflict, including by targeting Saudi nationals in their own countries, but they couldn't attack Saudi territory militarily with any degree of effectiveness. Saudi Arabia, however, has a strong alliance with Arab states, especially the United Arab Emirates and Jordan, and with the United States. Were such a conflict to occur, it is difficult to imagine that the United States would not become involved in one way or another in support of the Saudis. Although Iran could certainly raise the costs of American involvement by targeting U.S. naval vessels in the Persian Gulf directly or by targeting U.S. forces and nationals in other countries by proxy, Iran would have to balance such actions with the risk of drawing the United States into a more extensive war. Thus, the possible involvement of the United States would be the X factor in any potential conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Even if the two states are quite evenly matched, the military power that the United States could bring to bear would heavily tilt a conflict in Saudi Arabia's favor. In other words, it would be incredibly risky for Iran to court escalation with Saudi Arabia. Such a conflict likely wouldn't involve just Saudi Arabia, and Iran does not possess the capabilities to outlast a coalition military effort against it. Some observers detect a potential bright spot in the sudden willingness of the administration and the Iranians to resume negotiations. But bringing both sides to the table will be no easy task. Like the administration, Iran has some demands of its own. Tehran insists it won't consider negotiating any new nuclear accord until the Trump administration first comes back into compliance with the 2015 agreement, which would mean lifting the sanctions and ending its maximum pressure campaign. By withdrawing from the nuclear deal, it was the US, not Iran, who left the negotiating table, said Hossein Mousavian, a former spokesman for Iran's nuclear negotiations with the international community and now a professor at Princeton, told Newsweek. Therefore, if you want negotiations, you should come back to the nuclear deal, show your commitment to your signature and your words, and then we can negotiate on the other issues. While Trump has shown it's impossible to predict with any certainty what he might do, many analysts believe any return to the nuclear deal that Trump campaigns so hard to discredit would be political suicide for the president, who hopes to be re-elected in 2020. The administration cannot, under any circumstances, return to the original incarnation of the Iran deal without undermining its own credibility and its politics, Miller says. They would be skewered if, in fact, the purpose of the whole exercise was simply to return to the deal and try to sell sanctions relief twice. We'll keep you posted about this and many other hot news. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for the updates. Thank you and take care.